Alana Mathews is running for Sacramento's District Attorney's Office. The office is currently held by Anne Marie Schubert, who has announced her intention to run for Attorney General. Today on Everyday Injustice, we will talk with Alana about her candidacy. Welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, I always ask this question, but why are you running for district attorney in Sacramento?
That's a good question to ask. For me, it's really simple. I want to make the county more safe, more fair, and more just. It's as simple as that. For me, safety is a personal priority. I am personally a survivor of violence. And so, a lot of the traditional narrative, tough on crime policies, they're not working to keep communities safe. They're really just driving a narrative that normalizes crime for certain types of communities or crime against certain types of people. And I happen to come from one of those communities, and I find myself in that demographic of certain types of people. So I'm not running because the cases that I prosecuted made big headlines. I'm running because of my experience on the front lines of gun violence, racial violence, even domestic violence. I'm running because I'm a mom who raised 3 children, many of those years as a single mother in South Sacramento. I'm running because I've served as a mentor while I was a prosecutor to women who were on parole and at-risk youth, because I believe that transforming lives is just as important as protecting them. And so in this time and at this moment that we are in, we need a change of leadership. It's going to focus on keeping everybody safe and building a system that's fair and just for everybody.
So talk to me a little bit about your background and what you're doing right now.
Sure. So I'm from a small town in Northwest Indiana, Gary, Indiana. I grew up in a union household. My dad was a steel mill worker. My mom cleaned rooms in hospital, and they just worked really hard to try to provide a better life. And that their hard work sent me to Spelman College, the first one in my family to graduate, and led me to law school, which brought me here to Sacramento. But in between then, I married a minister and I started a family. So I have several years as a stay-at-home mom. And it was actually the work that I did. We moved to Sacramento to be urban missionaries. And it's that work that really prompted me to want to take that work to another level and get a law school degree. So me and my 3 children, I have to give them credit. We all went through law school. And my first job was at the DA's office as an intern. I got my JD in 03, LLM in 04, and the Attorney General's office paid for it. So I actually interned for them. And then I started my career as a deputy DA here in Sacramento County. So, worked up from intern to juvenile hall, misdemeanor trials, domestic violence, general felonies, violent crimes, and even prison crimes. And then in 2012, I was recruited to start the enforcement unit at the California Energy Commission, which was great timing for me. Unfortunately, I went through a very difficult divorce, but it allowed me to have an opportunity to be more present with my children. And so I did well in the enforcement unit, trying to get that off the ground. The following year, Governor Brown appointed me as the public advisor, which is like a public attorney official. And so I got to do a lot of public policy work, but really it gave me experience as an executive leader driving organizational change. So I got to work on environmental and energy policies and address the disparities and inequities that we often see. And from there, I was offered a position as chief consultant for the Joint Legislative Committee on Climate Change. So I got a chance to look at climate policy programs and investments statewide, again, addressing inequities and disparities and working with communities, to various stakeholders to build solutions and measurable outcomes. So currently, I'm a law professor at McGeorge School of Law, which is great to train kind of like the next generation of legal minds, not just what the law is, but how they should think about the law. What is the intent of the law, and how can the law better serve individuals? And I'm also the director of policy resources, training and membership at the Prosecutors Alliance of California.
So I guess I'll start with the Prosecutors Alliance. So for those who don't know, what is the Prosecutors Alliance and what do you do over there?
Yeah, it's an organization that supports reform-minded prosecutors who are just looking at a better way for our criminal justice system to work to protect communities and preserve the integrity and human dignity of those within the community. So what I do is I focus on policy resources. We really believe in data-driven solutions. And so I help identify what that data is and make that available. I do training. So we have just started our third Thursday training series where we look at trauma and the impact that it has on crime survivors. So that when you're prosecuting a case, you're not just focused on, okay, how can I get you on the stand and have that big emotional reaction so I can get that conviction? But we want to be a part of the healing process so that people don't feel exploited. We also want to focus on how we treat survivors and serve survivors to make sure they are actually healing in this process. It shouldn't be very one-dimensional. And so those are the sorts of things that I train on. And then membership, it's offered to anyone who believes that we can improve our criminal justice system. So it was founded by 4 elected DAs, but it's open and we have members not only from across the state, but actually across the country.
So, basically, in some ways, at least, it's kind of the progressive counterweight to the CDAA.
Well, when I joined it, I didn't, that's not how it was presented to me. I mean, some people may certainly characterize it that way, but I think the focus of CDAA has been very different. As a former prosecutor, the services that we offer wasn't in the programming that CDAA offered. So, such as, having the listening tours with survivors and focusing on that, having a victim advocates resource center so that we can also offer training to those who are working with survivors, and then looking at cutting edge technology and how that could be used to improve our criminal justice system. So I think it's just a different narrative, and we focus on what we think is important to make communities more safe.
And can you talk a little bit about your experience as a deputy district attorney in Sacramento and what you learned from that?
I think the number one thing that I learned was that the work you do in the community is just as important, if not more important, than what you do in the courtroom. When I was a DA, I was somewhat of an outlier because I mentored women on parole. And I think that comes from my background of how I came to Sacramento. I was really working and serving in the community. And I just knew in the environment that I grew up, in the community that I grew up, crime is not, one dimensional. It's not simple. It's very complex, and you have to have an approach that addresses all of the complexities. There's not one narrative that tells the story of all survivors. You have people who love people who violated them, and so they may not be cooperative. You have people who have just grown up without direction or guidance. And so understanding that, especially when I think about the women on parole who I mentored, it was just a matter of taking a phone call at 2 o'clock in the morning and saying, I know they stole your hot plate, but you don't want to go back and catch a case because you want to get your children back. And just being that support, or being there when, there's overwhelming frustration because at every turn where you're finally trying to make better decisions, it's so difficult to do that. And I also learned that with working with, at-risk youth who, instead of just having like some recreational program that people say, keep them out of trouble, building a career pathway to a better life. So what my parents were able to work and do for me, I've been involved with the Florida Law Academy. And the impact of having a mentor, the impact of having someone who looks like a lot of the students that I served and sharing with them, I faced the same challenges and struggles that you did, and you can become an attorney. It's much more impactful than, 30 days in a home taken away from your parents and keeping children on a right path. So again, the work that you do in the community, I think is just as important. And that's a lesson I learned at the DA's office and I took with me in all of my turns that my career has taken.
And while we're on this, one of the things that's really interesting to me, especially when we're dealing with women, is how much trauma and victimization leads down this kind of path toward incarceration. And it seems like we don't appreciate that connection nearly enough.
Absolutely. And you know, not enough can be said about that. I actually, the very first training that I did involved a young lady who had actually committed a homicide, but it was because her husband, who when he got out of prison said, "It's you or the other person." And that type of complexity, I mean, it's certainly, a tragedy when any life is lost. But I think that we can't just be reactive to crime. We have to be proactive. And that's why it's important to be present in the community so that you, as a district attorney, and that's what I plan to do, you are a part of those intervention strategies. You are a part of those prevention strategies so that you are helping women who find themselves. And you're not driving the narrative that just because you're in a domestic violence relationship, you caused it. My own personal experience, I had not wanted to date a person and they began to stalk me, and they had this delusion in their mind that they were still together. And for so many women, they did not do anything. Well, all women, it's not some women, they didn't do anything at all. And so we don't want to just drive that narrative. We have to be a part of the conversation at the intervention and the prevention stage. I was very fortunate to be a volunteer attorney for a domestic violence program here in Sacramento called Weave. And it was such a great experience, not only with the legal services that they offer, the counseling services they offer, but just the relationship among other women who understand and the time that they take to build the trust. And so I think the DA's office and all of, prosecutor's office, that's a part of serving survivors, and understanding the levels and the complexity of their trauma so that you meet them at a place where you're seeking healing and not just seeking, a specific outcome.
So, what are your concerns about the current DA's office?
My concerns are really stemming from what I'm hearing from so many people around the county. And that's just that they don't feel safe. They don't believe our criminal justice system is fair, and they don't believe that justice is for them. There is almost an entire, um, you know, demographic, class, group of people who just feel that they are left unprotected, whether it's with human trafficking or exploited for other purposes. But certainly one of the more profound ways where people feel there is not fairness is with accountability for police misconduct. There's an article in a local paper that really revealed details of an officer involved shooting where the officers tried to run over this particular person twice and then immediately shot him. And the Sacramento Police Department acted immediately in holding those officers accountable. But there was no accountability in the DA's office. So that's something that needs to be addressed. And notice I said accountability for police misconduct. It's not, a statement against police officers. I worked with them for almost a decade in the office, and I value the important work that they do. But the implications when incidents like that happens is that it erodes the trust in the entire system. So when we have really bad actors that commit really violent and serious crimes, the community is not going to speak up because they don't know if they're on this side of the criminal justice system or the other side. Like we have two different systems, and that just erodes the trust. And I think that's not just a sentiment of the community, but I think it's shared by some officers as well. When they've worked up a case, they put in time and effort, but there seems to be two different standards of what charges get filed on. So I think those are two areas where we can improve, and they may not be the most, non-controversial talking points, but it's something we have to address. We need to address if we really truly want to make Sacramento County more safe and we want it to be a more fair and just legal system. Because at the end of the day, that's all everybody wants. It's just a fair and just legal system. People commit crimes, they ought to be held accountable, but we can't have two different systems.
Yeah, and so, you were referring to the Joseph Mann case, which, if you watch that video, which I, of course, have a number of times, not only are they trying to run over the guy, but they're going, hit that guy, hit that guy. And then they get out and they run him down and they shoot him. And the DA's office declined to file criminal charges in that case, which, to most, progressive-minded people and non-lawyers is kind of nonsensical. Like, how can you clearly have animus and be motivated to kill a guy and not face criminal charges?
But I think it goes beyond. I wouldn't even put the label progressive minded people. I think anybody who is concerned about safety and fairness and justice, they look at that and they feel that, that doesn't make sense. So, I mean, we certainly live in a world where people have labels, but I think that for me, I recognize that sometimes that's one of the ways that divides us. And if we are really going to have a community that's more safe, more fair, more just, we've got to come together. So I don't necessarily lead with any ideology or identity. I just lead with my values, because everybody wants to be safe, everybody wants to be fair, and everybody wants justice.
So how do you evaluate, the other high-profile Stephan Clark killing? I mean, as a prosecutor, what are you looking at?
Well, I don't know all the facts of that case, but what I will say was more important about the Stephan Clark case, and I've had a conversation with his brother, is that whatever the decision the district attorney makes, when you decide to go public with that, first of all, you need to talk to the family. And second of all, you don't spend an hour or more, talking about the person's character, like killing them again, all over again. You just have to be mindful. And I will also say that I think that is instructive of the need for prosecutorial independence. I've stated publicly, I am not taking money from police unions, associations, and that's not because I don't support the hard work of our police officers. It's entirely the opposite. Because as DA, having to make that decision, you want the community to believe and trust that you're making it on the merits and not because you're getting a political contribution or you're on their payroll in some other type of way. And so I think that's the most valuable lesson to learn moving forward and where the DA's office and the leadership, the new leadership should be.
So, and I understand you're early in your campaign, but what issues are you really focused on as you move forward here?
What I'm moving forward on is based on what I learned as public advisor at the California Energy Commission, and that's listen to the community. it seems like a good talking point to say, let's build bridges or let's, bring the disconnect. But if you don't even know what it is, what's really impacting, um, you know, citizens of Sacramento County's everyday lives, right? So because I'm in the early stages, I don't have some fancy poll, or I don't have, big endorsements, or, people guiding that. So I'm actually going to the community. I'm talking to community members, business owners, elected leaders, and saying, what are the types of things that you're hearing? And of course, the the growing issue of those who are unhoused in our community, the substance abuse and mental illness that we also see in our community, and understanding we can't criminalize that. We can't incarcerate our way out of those issues. We have to have common sense reforms that allows those individuals to get the services and the treatments that they need. And I'm really being responsive and being led by what the community is expressing, the sentiment of what makes them feel unsafe, or what are the issues of unfairness that they're facing.
So how would you address issues of concern like mass incarceration?
Well, we see, I mean, the war on drugs taught us that we're doing more harm in our communities. One of the things that the Prosecutors Alliance does, that I alluded to, is we focus on data-driven solutions, and the data shows that longer sentences do not keep communities safe. In fact, they do just the opposite. And so we have to find other ways where we are still holding offenders accountable, but we're focused more on rehabilitation, which equates to justice than punishment. So what I think about, incarceration is certainly people who commit very violent and serious crimes need to be separated from society. But we also have to address the root causes of crime to reduce crime. And mass incarceration has not been an effective tool in reducing crime. So we need to find out what is and focus on that.
And what are your thoughts on bail reform?
Again, we actually just had a California Supreme Court case that talked about, the constitutionality of locking someone in jail based on their ability to pay. So I certainly support, um, you know, reform that, stands with that, but it also has to, prioritize safety, public safety. So I think having that as a priority and not a person's ability to pay is the direction we need to go in.
And then, kind of another big issue in the system right now is that if you look at the system, kind of from the moment of police contact, and you could argue before that, but we'll start with at the moment of police contact, Black and brown people more likely to be contacted by police, more likely to be arrested by police, more likely to be prosecuted, more likely to be convicted, more likely to be held in custody pre-trial, and then at the back end, more likely to serve prison time, and when they do serve prison time, it's longer. Where do we break that cycle? What would you do as a district attorney to help address racial inequities?
Well, I would follow the law. And there's a new law called the California Racial Justice Act that went into effect on January 1st of this year. And the purpose of that law is to achieve eliminating racial bias out of our criminal justice system. And it starts from the point of contact. And I actually train on that law to help prosecutors understand how you look at that. I mean, some of the law involves data collection. So I think the DA's office should be proactive in looking at the data and who they charge, how they charge. And they also have to be proactive in sentencing and looking at that data as well. Not only because it's the right thing to do, but it's now the law. So we have to do that. And I also think, in a much broader view of looking at racial equities. And that's what I think I bring to this office. If I'm elected, is having worked in executive leadership, working at the Capitol, being a public policy expert, looking at this more broadly is how are we devoting our resources, and looking at addressing racial inequities means when you have officers in certain communities, what are the types of crimes that they are arresting? What are the types of crimes that we are prosecuting? And looking at how many, because that takes away the resources not only of the prosecutors, but also the police department, where they could be focusing on more serious and violent crimes that are hurting communities and keeping victims, survivors, not keeping them safe at all. So when we look at that, I mean, that data is not just about racial justice. It's actually about safety. It's actually about better use of resources. It's actually about fiscal responsibility. So I think those implications are far reaching just beyond what racial inequities are, but certainly, as a person of color and being allied with so many other people of color, but I think even with income level, I think you could see a lot of those correlations as well with, people in the lower socioeconomic status. So we definitely have to address that, not just as a moral or social issue, but it's also a fiscal and legal one as well.
And speaking of which, one of the shocking stats, and I haven't looked at it lately, and so may have changed slightly, but the percentage of district attorneys' offices that are led by either women or and especially people of color is extraordinarily low. I think it was less than 10%. So how does that perspective help guide you in terms of looking to change the way things are done?
Uh, I don't think it's guiding. I think it's just informative, but that's the story of my life. I've been undervalued, underestimated, and told I'm not qualified in so many different instances of my life. And I've proved them wrong every single time. But again, I'm driven by my values. I'm driven by seeing a need for change and standing in the gap, rising to the occasion to bring the change. So the statistics, while they're there, and I know that they're there, I'm a graduate of Spelman College, so I'm inspired by what my Spelman sister Stacey Abrams has done. And, I'm also a part of a sorority that I happen to share with our Madam Vice President. And so, there are barriers, but they can definitely be broken. And I think this office needs someone who is qualified, committed, and courageous. And knowing that I'm all three of those, statistics don't faze me at all.
Yeah, and my question wasn't quite to that. It was more to the effect of, and I guess I'll be a little blunt. A lot of white males kind of discount the role of race. At least they did up until, maybe the last year or two, when all of a sudden everybody seemed to find religion on this issue. But and there just seems to be a disconnect that you go into DA's offices, and I go into courtrooms in many different counties across the state, and you see the same thing over and over again. You see black and brown people that are facing charges, and you see white prosecutors, most of them white males, and the connection is important because a lot of white males do not empathize with people of color and the circumstances that people of color have grown up in and are dealing with.
I just have to say that I have to be guided by my experience. And while I understand that narrative and that reality, it's not the definitive one for me. And so you're absolutely right. There are lots of people who are not empathetic, and any demographic can face that way. But I want to focus on what needs to change and how we change it. And so I think just by running, I'm challenging that narrative and I'm giving other people the opportunity to redefine that narrative as well. I voted
Um,
for me.
And I also wanted to ask you, so, one of the, I guess, buzzwords, for lack of a better term, that we've been hearing lately is this notion of declination, the idea that certain crimes really shouldn't be prosecuted. I happen to believe that there are whole classes of crimes that would be better dealt with outside of the criminal legal system. What would your office look like with regard to that?
Yeah, my office would certainly want us to prioritize. And again, appreciating the hard work that police officers do, we want to direct their attention and focus to more serious crimes. And the same thing with our prosecutors in our office. Certainly we should be focusing on, more serious crimes like sexual assaults, homicides, gun violence. And I think that usually in the conversation about declinations, we're looking at things like loitering or crimes that involve people who may have a very low socioeconomic status. But my office will also be sensitive to the implications it has for criminalization of gender identity. And that brings up, the disproportionate amount of contacts and encounters with trans women, particularly trans women of color. So, whereas I may just be walking down the street and no one would think anything of it, or you may be walking down the street, but a trans woman of color sometimes finds herself being questioned or accused of loitering for prostitution. So there are a lot of other things that I'll just take a moment to say. On the 3rd August and the third Thursday in August, we will be having a training on misdemeanor declinations and providing the data and research and showing what that actually has shown. Glad to have one of the leading experts in this area, Anna Harvey from New York University. So hopefully you can join and get a little bit more insight.
I would I would be honored to be able to join in to that. And I believe I've read their research paper that came out recently on the impact of declination on misdemeanor charges.
Yes.
And so kind of the final policy area, and I see this as really the nexus between the rights of victims and the rights of the accused. One big problem in the system as we know it now is that, victims are not necessarily helped just by throwing the book at their offenders, whereas the offenders often can be punished and never have to really take responsibility for what they did. And so I am a big advocate of restorative justice because restorative justice focuses on what are the needs of the victim and also creates a mechanism to actually hold the offender accountable for what they did to help them understand the harms that they caused and to figure out ways to rectify those harms. So how would your office look at restorative justice practices?
I would fully embrace having a restorative justice program, and you would see one. I was actually fortunate when I got my LLM at McGeorge. I did my thesis on restorative justice program, and I actually studied the Gacaca courts of Rwanda when that country went through a reconciliation, a national reconciliation of people who had committed the most horrific crimes and seeing the outcomes, and not only being survivor centered and accountability based, but really driving public safety. And I think in our office, it would also serve an additional purpose of being racially informed, because that's a big part of restorative justice and taking into account everyone's lived experience. So I certainly would support that. And I think Sacramento, there's a lot of people in Sacramento County who would like to see that as well.
And then as we wrap up here, are there other issues that I didn't ask you about that you wanted to talk about briefly? I'm sure there are a lot, but
Well, I'm still in listening mode. You know, I am listening and talking to members of the community, business owners, elected leaders, really trying to learn what are the most public safety driven issues that they are concerned about. I think being the district attorney, you know, when you walk into court, you say for the people, and if I'm going to serve effectively the people of Sacramento County, I want to know what's the priority for them.
Great. Well, I want to thank you for coming on our show and sharing a bit about your background and your candidacy for district attorney.
Thank you for having me.
This has been Everyday Injustice. That was Alana Mathews. She's a candidate for DA in Sacramento. It's a race that's coming up next year. This has been David Greenwald. Join us again next time for more tales from the injustice system.